Okay.
All right. So welcome everybody to the Open Referral Assembly. I'm sharing a link to our notes document in the chat. In the notes document, we have a little bit of a roll call. And if you would go ahead and leave your name and your affiliation. We have a really packed agenda today and a bunch of people on this call. So I'm going to make the dubious decision of not inviting you all to introduce yourself verbally. But please do share in the document and or in the chat, like introduce yourself, tell us who you are, what you're with. And if you have any questions up front that you want to make sure to get on the agenda, please go ahead and do so in that way. And I just shared an orientation to new folks. The key links for that orientation are here in the notes. And then I have an agenda sketched out below. During this meeting, we're going to hear from the Open Data Services Cooperative, which has been doing some work on upgrading our technical specifications and associated collateral tools. We'll hear from Open Referral UK and the leadership there that's been promoting the UK sort of chapter of this branch. I'll give a couple of updates about partnerships that are underway that are relevant and other updates, and we'll have some show and tell from at least a handful of groups that are using Open Referrals tools in different ways and have things to share. And by the way, I have Site Savvy Connect 211 on that list. We might have a presentation from the DC pilot about their work with the Open Referral Services platform built by Serapis, although I think Serapis is not able to be here. We'll have hopefully some insight from the Unity Foundation about their work on our transformer and validator tools. And we may have a presentation from Exigy about their work on ServiceNet. And then we'll talk a little bit about what comes next, moving ahead into 2022. Any questions? There's a whole lot of links out to key materials where you can orient yourself. For new folks who are still just joining, welcome. Please check out the document that I'm linking to in the chat, add your name to the roll call. Any questions or other things, like if somebody wants to jump in to the show and tell, let's see if we can see if anybody wants to share something. I don't know if we're going to get to everybody, but let's hear it. And one way or another, I will make sure that this group hears about your work and we'll create space to talk about it. So either add that to the roll call or the chat, or feel free to put something right now on our agenda. Speak up, introduce yourself if you so choose. Or if you even just have questions that you'd like us to talk about in this hour. All right, we can jump in. We've got a great group here. Cool. If we have time at the end, we'll pause for, people can sort of introduce themselves and we can have some open chat. But I want to at least walk through the things happening with the specification and across our network. First, I'll just say, the last thing I'll say before we jump in and hear from the Open Data Services Cooperative. As I mentioned a few minutes ago on our orientation, the last time we had one of these like open assemblies was actually late 2018. It has been several years since then. I realized as I looked through this notes document, I'm a little embarrassed, and I apologize that it's been so long since I convened the agenda, the whole network. In late 2018, the Alliance of Information and Referral Systems officially endorsed Open Referral's protocols, the Human Service Data Specification, as standards. And that was like the first objective of this initiative. And I took some time off after that. We accomplished our first goal, and the network stayed busy. My role somewhat subsided into a more part-time capacity. In the last year, it's picked back up. And I thank Skylar and Devin Balkan for encouraging us from the community to get this process back together. If this goes well and people want to keep doing it, this may be the kind of thing that we continue doing on a monthly or bi-monthly basis through the next year, because I do think there's enough going on now to justify it. So my apologies that it's been so long for us to get face-to-face, and thank you for bearing with me as we get some introductions out of the way. Cool. So over the last 4 or 5 months, we've had a range of activities in the GitHub repository, and I'm going to hand this to my partners at Open Data Services Cooperative. Rob and James, feel free to introduce yourselves and the organization, if you would, and talk to us about what you've been up to and what you want us to know.
Hello. So we are from Open Data Services Co-op. There's 20 of us now working across the UK. We sort of work on various open data standards and policy areas. But I'm up in Scotland and Rob's down in England. I guess I'll just get started and I'll see if there's any questions quickly. We're going to talk about very sort of different things. So I'm just going to first quickly talk about work on the Open Referral standard documentation website. So hopefully you can all see the slides fine. Cool.
Can we? I think, Skylar, can you make, I am not seeing the slides. What am I missing? Oh, Skylar, can you make James a co-host? Is that possible?
I'm seeing the slides. Is anyone else not seeing them?
It's just me, huh?
I am seeing them.
Yeah, I can see them.
Okay, I see it. All right, my bad. Go ahead. Apologies.
No worries. Cool. So I've been working on the Open Referral Standard documentation website. So first of all, boring bits. So we've updated the build process. We switched to a new Markdown renderer. So just sort of boring points, but just to say that we are keeping the website maintained and up to date so that it's easy to work on. So this bit isn't new, but I just wanted to highlight it because we're going to be mentioning it a lot in following stuff. So the data in the repository, there's data package.json, which is a machine readable schema file. And that's the source of the schema information, essentially. So you can actually think of the standard as being the data package.json schema and the normative docs. And we actually use this schema file to generate sections of the docs automatically. And other tools can take this file and use it too as well. So what have we been doing recently? So first of all, we've moved the example data into this repository. So previously it was in a separate repository. So we've moved it into the standard documentation repository. It'll just make it easier to keep in sync against the standard and all the different versions of the standard. And to help with that, we've also added GitHub Actions continuous integration so that anytime someone who is working on the example data or working on the schema pushes up some new code, then the continuous integration server will automatically run and test that for you, test the schema against the data package, test the example data against the schema and make sure it's correct. And that will help keep the example data in good shape. We are going to be, I think we're looking at some more work on the example data, just in terms of what's actually helpful to show and how it's helpful to explain concepts. So the other thing we've done is that we have database schemas, which are now generated automatically. So previously there was a MySQL database schema in repository, and this was manually created for version 1, which is now out of date because we're on version 2. And it also had some tables for things like users and keys, which weren't part of the standard. So now we have database schema tables, which are generated automatically from data package.json again by GitHub continuous integration. And I can tell people about the technical details of that later if anyone's interested. But it just means that if someone wants to work with the data, they can just grab a database schema file, create a database, and we'll have all the tables, all the foreign keys set up for them. And again, because it's generated automatically, it will stay in sync with any sort of schema work. And we've done this from MySQL 8. That file can also be used from MariaDB with a slight change, which will make sure it's documented. We've done it for Postgres. We started looking at SQL Server, but some of the tooling got a bit tricky. But if that's a high priority, we can come back to that and look again. SQLite could be quite nice. People who are working in Python notebooks can just grab an SQLite file and start loading data straight in. So the other thing, also we've improved the ERD diagrams. So there's a new sort of core diagram that only shows the key tables. And then in the full diagram, we've got color coding between the core tables and the other tables. And again, this is generated from the data package.json and little CSV file listing core tables. So it's kept in sync. So all this generating stuff from the schema file, it has its sort of advantages of keeping things in sync and making the website easy to work on. But the other advantage too, as well, is it helps us test the schema file and make sure it's all working well. So while I've been doing that previous work, I've noticed a couple of sort of minor things in the schema file that I think could do with fixing up, and I've made issues and we'll hopefully get to look at all of them soon. But so as well as the advantage of keeping everything sync, make it easy to work with, we're also really testing the schema file and making a good schema file that other people can take and use in their applications. So that's my bit, and I don't know if you want to check if there's any questions first quickly, or
James, if you could link to the new sample data.
Yep.
If you could provide a link to that in the document, that would be helpful.
I'll put I'll put our links in a second.
Right on. So we have some non-technical folks on this call. Trust me, like I caught about 10-20% of that. I trust Open Data Services Cooperative. I do my best to represent non-technical users through this process. If people do have technical questions, I don't. Let's hear them. Although I'm not sure we're going to get into an in-depth discussion about any of this stuff. If you're as a technical person or non-technical person, let's surface whatever questions come up. Either answer them on the spot, or we will sort of note them for future discussion.
Cool.
Yes, and Ian, I'm going to leave some links to the Airtable in the notes that you're mentioning.
Yeah, and like this package isn't tied with that Airtable, right? That's maintained separately.
At the moment, yes, I think.
Okay,
it would be very nice. That's a good point.
Yep, cool.
The Airtable's interesting because one of the things that the standard the core standard takes a lots of tables approach to its structure, and Airtable's generally easier with fewer tables, especially if you have just one-to-one relationships between a lot of the tables. So the standard does say that you're allowed to do that, but to do that in a machine readable way would be kind of cool. And yeah, I've never actually used it. I've never tried to generate stuff on Airtable programmatically. I assume it's relatively straightforward. But there might be an interesting artifact for us to make to sort of encode which are the most common one-to-one relationships and to encode that into the Airtable form. It's a shame Devin's not here because I'm sure he'd have lots of views on that.
Yeah, so Devin Balkand from Serapis will be talking about some of their work later. He produced the Airtable that I have now. I've linked under the show and tell under OR services/Serapis. You can see my cursor here. The Airtable, which has been upgraded to 2.0, is one of the most popular things that's come out of this community of practice so far, because if you have a resource directory that's pretty simple and you want a basic upgrade, you can load your data into this Airtable, and it's like a content management system. If you want to get started cheap and easy, this is a pretty good way to start managing at least a small scale set of resource data. And also, if you want to be able to have an environment to work with data, it's a cheap option. And it has, APIs built into it, and would welcome suggestions for how we can continue ensuring that is a useful tool for sort of like low-level, lo-fi data projects.
Can I ask a bit of a naive question? The structures of the format being like largely around CSV from what I've read, and maybe I'm missing something. When it goes into Airtable, like it has APIs built out of the box, just because it's Airtable and it builds APIs for you. Like from an open referral perspective, like what is, there's a lot of focus on the data structures. What is the focus on the actual like API interface side of the puzzle?
All right, so we let's loop back to that. That is on our agenda if we can get to it. We do have an initial set of API protocols. HSDS, the schema, is like the core open referral protocol, but then there's HSDA, the Human Service Data API protocols that Ken Lane first authored in 2016. He offered a sort of straw man version of HSDA 2.0. And we'll talk a little bit about a little bit later about how we move forward on the API standardization front, because it's a little more challenging than what we've taken on so far. Okay, any other quick questions about what we heard from James? And again, I'm sure you guys have questions. We'll answer the quick ones. We'll note the ones that we want to come back to and discuss at greater length. Feel free to leave questions in the chat or in the document that we can address later. Rob, I expect you might have other, we can talk a little bit about the plans we have for the documentation as well. But Rob, do you have other things to add?
I was going to move us on to talking about profiles and extensions in to the standard, if that's okay.
Yes, yeah, go for it.
And this I guess underlines that within Open Referral we have HSDS and HSDA, and the A is the API and the S is the data structure. Obviously the two are deeply related, but I would absolutely love to talk more about how we govern an API specification, how we decide how to resolve all of the possibilities that exist, and how valuable that is in and of itself. The UK, Open Referral UK, have done a lot of work around this for the UK context specifically that I think is very applicable to everyone else. I think it's either it's very generic or it's very genericizable, if that's even a word. But that's yeah, something I'm very keen for us to explore. So when I talk about application profiles, actually, James, can you reload? I've changed the title on this slide while you were talking. So I don't want to call it extensions, get that word out your head. It's not a helpful one for this conversation. Think of this as profiles, possibly application profiles. Thanks. So when you take Open Referral, specifically HSDS at this point, but obviously it's going to have interactions with API, and you want to use it in a particular way, how do you go about that? James, can you move us on, please? I'm trying to avoid the UK's chief medical officer in COVID briefings got famous for saying, next slide, please. So at its heart, a data standard is a bunch of things that describe data, schema, and a bunch of documentation, which tells the people who are using that schema the rules that either can't at all or can't easily be checked by a machine. At its heart, something might say that a field is called name. The machine can check that it's a string. The human has to do the work of checking that what's in the name field is actually the name of the thing. So when we talk about standard, it's those two things together. For schema for an API spec, you may well replace that with like the machine bits of an API specification, but the docs give it meaning. Cool, next slide, please. So an application profile is when you want to put a standard to work in a more specific way than the standard is designed for. Open Referral is super flexible. You can use it in a ton of different ways. But if you've got a particular group of people who want to work together in a particular way, then you want to document the additional agreement that they've made. And that's what we've seen in the UK. That in the UK, we're in a very specific context. There's some parts of the standard which aren't particularly relevant or that we have to use in a particular way in order for them to make sense, and we can document what those are. And there's really three things that you need in order to build up a profile. You need some way for the machines to know what the difference is between two versions of the schema, the base version and the modified version. It could add stuff, it could take stuff away, it could change requirements around things, but you need something for the machines. You need something for the humans. You need some documentation to say if the rules have changed. So I talked about a name field earlier. Maybe in a particular context, you want to say this is surname only. Maybe in a different context, the term surname is completely meaningless because it's a culture that doesn't use the allocations of names that mine does. So there's some stuff there about the human bits, the rules. And then the combination of those is in and of itself an artifact. It's something that can be reasoned about, discussed, versioned. And ultimately, when we talk about Open Referral UK, we want to know that we're talking about a very particular set of things. Next slide, please. So for the schema, you want something machine readable to describe the what differences, additions, removals, changes, or to enforce particular interpretations, like Open Referral is fairly flexible, especially around taxonomies, and that's a very intentional choice around HSCS 2.0. But if you want to choose a particular version of those for better semantic interoperability, you need to document that somehow. There's a few different technologies that let you do this. JSON Merge Patch and JSON Patch are RFC standards. They exist. Jolt is a programmatic way, another programmatic way of doing this. These vary in how they work. Some of them describe a series of operations that you do to get from one version of a schema to another. Think of those as a bit more like the Python approach of a procedural thing. Some are much more declarative. Think of them as more like the closure of this, like they describe the differences, and it's an exercise for the user to or the machine to apply those changes. Which of those is used, which is most relevant, I'm not going to form an opinion on right now, but yeah, there's a bunch of technology there that exists for this. Next slide, please. Then for documentation, you can either replace documentation entirely. Open Referral UK refers to the Open Referral docs, but it has its own doc site. It has its own thing. It's big enough and is enough of its own entity to say, this is how you use this thing we made, and that's cool. Or describing the differences. Maybe you have a page that says, if you're using this profile, here's the extra stuff you need to know. There's higher and lower tech versions of that. And finally, James, last slide, please. Yeah, we should have this thing to reason about. Like, what do we mean when we refer to Open Referral UK? What's in scope for it? What's not? Like, even as I'm talking about it, there's an initiative, a project, a group of people called Open Referral UK. They're not versioned for this, but there's a bunch of stuff that is, and there's a fuzzy middle between them. And so defining what it is that is in scope for this, that can be versioned, can be referred to, can be reasoned about, is important. There are technical approaches to this that other standards have used that describe this, but I'm not going into detail on those. Just that it's important to say it's important to have something that is a package that can be discussed. And that's me.
All right, let me see if I'm going to try to bridge that brief presentation with what we'll hear from Mike. We might have switched the order, so let me see if I can provide some context. HSDS is intended to be a flexible, it's establishing a standard vocabulary for exchange, but we recognize that rather than trying to solve everybody's use case, right, which is where that XKCD cartoons logic goes awry, we develop something that is minimally viable and more or less useful in most of the instances, recognizing that there's going to be a need to localize and customize, localize for geographical, and different countries and different places, and customize for specific domains that might have particular conventions, idiosyncrasies that wouldn't be generalizable all in one spec. And so we're supporting the process of extending the spec in various ways. And Rob is proposing a path towards then being able to recognize bundles of extensions and potentially, including some constraints and variations in some sort of formal way that still enables interoperability, even as the spec is adapted across places and domains. Rob, did I do a good summary there?
Spot on.
All right, great. Cool. I think there are still some open questions, right? What we're hearing from Rob is that there are still some open questions about the best way to do that. And this is going to be one of our agenda items in 2022, is now that we do have a real international community of people adapting the spec in different places, how do we ensure that we promote that adaptation while still preserving some interoperability and some cohesion at the core? And we would welcome questions and feedback. We're going to hear from Open Referral UK, Mike Thacker. It's been a pleasure working with you, Mike, over the last couple of years. I'm excited to hear an update from you all about what you've been up to.
Thanks, Greg. Can you hear me? Yeah.
Yep.
Great. Yeah. So a couple of slides on the background and where we are now in the UK, and then I'll provide probably a slightly less technical overview of what Rob was alluding to, and where what we've done in the UK might fit into a broader picture, and how we might better align UK and US international work. We probably about 2 or 3 years ago, the Department for Local Government Services Information, and they recommend a number of approaches, and particularly liked Open Referral because of its maturity and the community around it. And that's led to a variety of other pieces of work, which have culminated in the Open Referral UK standard, which is a formal extension of the Open Referral standard. So it complies with it, but we've added some extra bits. There's now a website which tells people how to adopt it and how to commission services which use it, and has about 12 case studies from people who've adopted it to various degrees, and has a developers tools site which has got lots of documentation and tools, including a validator of API feeds that correspond with that validate according to the schema. An API query tool where you can just query a service directory online, and alongside you see what the API calls being made are to that. And a service directory exporter, which is not quite Airtable in that it's only one way, but it creates on the fly a Google sheet with one tab per table in the tabular data structure. And it also sets up links between the tabs, so you don't have to fully understand the one-to-many structures, for people who just want to inspect what's in a database, but not necessarily write it out. We found that Airtable's limit on the number of rows was a bit too constraining, whereas we like the philosophy. And lastly, on this site, we've got a forum, which is where we're encouraging discussion, particularly as GitHub is not very well adopted for the non-techies. So we've got technical and non-technical forums, and some of the US people have been contributing to that, as well as people in the UK. And I'll give you a link to it at the end. So we're now in a position where the Government Data Standards Authority is recommending to its board that across UK government for interoperability of services data, and the National Health Service has a procurement framework for social prescribing tools, whereby people are prescribed non-medical interventions for the likes of addressing loneliness, physical fitness, that sort of thing that doesn't need drugs. And that framework requires people to use Open Referral UK if they purchase social prescribing tools under the framework. They're not required to use the framework, but that's taken us a long way towards getting Open Referral UK built into the public sector structure over here. And to kind of satisfy people that it's well governed and well maintained, we're speaking with the Open Data Institute, which is an international institute, but based in London, at taking a kind of governance role to make sure the standards looked after properly long term, and any monies that come its way are properly distributed. And the ODI have just recently published a paper on unlocking the potential of social prescribing and looking at the savings that can be made by using data standards and transferring data around non-medical interventions to reduce medical costs. So there's a lot going on there. In terms of the actual standard, and Rob has kind of alluded to this, but we took HSDS, the data structure, and our local government standards body added some additions to that standard to make things a bit more precise. For instance, we added taxonomy terms that relate to eligibility rather than just a block of text. So we added a few things such that services could be searched more precisely, and we could use some of the existing standards, such as standards defining administrative areas in the UK. And out of that, we built Open Referral UK, which can be seen as an application profile on HSDS plus the additions. So we're using about 2/3 of HSDS plus the UK additions. And we've got a machine-driven way of doing what's in that arrow, of going from this to that application profile. And I think our vision, and keen on your approval or otherwise of this, is that HSDS is extended with those parts of the UK extensions which have proved useful. And actually HSDS version 2 already adds quite a lot of those. So we've got one big HSDS, and we then take different application profiles on that for different scenarios. So there's HSDS Classic, as Devon calls it, which is kind of your version 1 or your version 2 as it stands. We've got HSDS UK, which is the UK Open Referral, and they're country specific, but more properly in long term. We don't care about the location, we care about the application. So we might have an application profile that's particularly suitable for, say, social prescribing in the context of the NHS in the UK, and we might have different application profiles for different purposes. And I understand that you're looking at a core tables sort of cut down Open Referral, which just looks at the main tables, and that could be seen as an application profile on HSDS. So what Rob was describing is how we get from this big one to these little ones, you know, what sits behind these arrows. And there are various ways of doing that. But just as James was saying that all the resources we've got in HSDS are machine generated, like the entity relation diagram is machine generated, the documentation is machine generated, the SQL script to create the database in various languages is machine generated. Likewise, we want these application profiles to be machine generated such that there's no ambiguity as to how we create them. And we could potentially have multiple versions of HSDS, but it wouldn't just be 2, 3, 4, 5. It would be 2 as an application profile for core tables, 2 as an application profile for social prescribing or whatever. And that application profile is defined by the logic that sits by that arrow, which could be a bit of JSON code, or it could be something else coming from from various standards bodies. And that's what Rob's been looking at. Now, if we come on to HSDA, the API, the application programmer interface script, we've developed our own API, which is very similar to HSDA, and we have Swagger documentation for it. But much as we've just talked about using machine-driven means of generating application profiles, we use machine-driven means of generating the query responses, the structure of the JSON that would come out of an API query, a method call, such that if you want to get services in summary, or you want to get detailed information about a service or an organization or a location, there's no ambiguity as to what that might sit. Now what's happened in the US is that there is a bit of ambiguity, or there's a bit of subjectivity as to how HSDA was produced. And as a result, there are minor, and they're only minor, variations between HSDA and what we've got in the UK. But I guess I'm keen on our approach, and I would be, wouldn't I? But because there's no ambiguity as to how you create it, such that if we have multiple application profiles, there's no ambiguity as to what the API response would look like when you do a get services or a get organizations or whatever. And we've defined 20 or 30 web methods, but in practice, there are only really 2 or 3 that we encourage people to use heavily. So I'm kind of promoting those as a core set. There's /services is the main one. And if you get these slides, and I've linked to them in the documentation, these links are live. So they are live queries to service directories. So that one gives us the first 50 services in a Bristol services directory. That gives us the services in detailed information for one particular service. And these are the only methods you really need, plus perhaps 1 or 2 about taxonomy terms, in order to be able to extract all the data from a directory and stick it into another directory. So if, for instance, you're building an aggregator, all you're concerned about is that the source directory is compliant with 2 or 3 web methods to with not many parameters. So I guess we're pushing that as a very core set of what a directory ought to comply with. But there are different levels of compliance with an API for different purposes. Now, if you come onto a service finder, and we've got quite a few service finders which are just JavaScript, they have no database of their own because they rely entirely on the queries that are run by the service directories that feed them. So this is a sample call to the Bristol services directory that says, get me services. I think the example I've used is get me services of a particular type defined by a particular taxonomy term. And that's the sort of query that a service directory could perform. And there are probably 6 or 8 parameters that we push for the /services method if you want to be able to query a directory directly without running your own database off it. And if we come on to look at one of our tools is a dashboard which looks at other people's service feeds. So these are live feeds in the UK, and you can look at this live on our site. We check it overnight, every night, and you get a tick in the box if the API is up. You get another tick if the /services works. You get another one if /services ID for a randomly picked ID works. And then you get extra ticks if those search parameters work. And if they're only partial, you can hover over here and see what's compliant and what's not. And if you want to go on, you can look at the details of the API, and you can run our full validator against any of these API feeds. And what that means is if you take a feed from one directory, like the Hull City Council services directory, you can connect any service finder to it, and you can just change the API it points to, and you can switch to a different one like Bristol or Blackburn. And it all works because they're using the same API, which we validate and check. And we're telling people if they buy an Open Referral UK compliant service directory, they should insist as part of the procurement that the directory supplier complies with that. Okay, so that's as far as we've got. I'd encourage you to sign up to the forum and see what's happening. There is a discussion there, particularly on what Rob has talked about as different approaches of generating those application profiles from an extended database. We've also got a mailing list. That's just an outward mailing list. I think Greg was considering, and you may want to discuss this at some point, whether or not we can migrate from the Open Referral Google Groups into the Discourse forum, perhaps with some US specific threads, but most things, frankly, most of the issues you're having in the US are the same ones we're having in the UK. And if you've got a particular implementation you want to register and ideally have featured on our dashboard, just let us know. That's it. Thanks, Greg.
Mike, thank you for that. It's really exciting stuff. Let me see if I can briefly try to recap. For context, we worked with Ken Lane to develop the first version of the Human Services Data Specification. He's the API evangelist. He's worked with Microsoft and Google in the White House. He's now Postman's chief API evangelist. HSDS reflects like what we found in the field, reflecting decades of knowledge and experience and implementation. When we looked for APIs, we found very little. Right, so HSDA, the API specifications that we first came out with, reflected Ken's sort of like normative assessment of what could be possible, and he went big. It's somewhat maximalist, right? But we just did not have much empirical evidence of how people wanted APIs to work, because back in 2016, especially, there just weren't many implementations that we found. Now we have more insight about how people want things to work. The UK seems to have a working and somewhat minimal approach to API specifications. And we are going to see in 2022 how we can move from Ken's maximalist approach, which is still in our repos, to something that actually looks more workable and practical based on these experiences in the field. If you're interested in being a part of that API specification development process, please be in touch. We want you in the conversation. The current plan is for Open Data Services Co-op to establish a prototype of sort of like bundling up Open Referral UK as a profile of HSDS, and then we'll work backwards to implementation of their version of HSDA, potentially in the DC pilot project, but potentially elsewhere. And if you want to be a part of this process in 2022, please let us know. I have a few more updates. We are running short on time, which I'm not surprised about. It's awesome to have so much going on. I don't want to breeze past. I assume people might have questions for Mike. Please put them into the chat or the document. I want to give at least a couple of other people some chance to do some show and tell. We want to note your questions, and we can probably organize a follow-up conversation that might be a little bit more open-ended and explore some of these issues in more of a conversation. If anything is burning, let me know right now. Okay, I'll give a couple brief updates. Then I want to hear from Skylar at Site Savvy, and I also noticed that Devin joined us. Devin, let us know in the chat if you're able to join us and actually talk about the work you've been doing with OR services for about 5 minutes. Okay, great. And Devin, you just joined after we got the presentation about the OR UK API. And so maybe we'll have some time after 12 if you all want to have a more open-ended conversation. So let me loop back to you. Real quickly, I want to give you all a couple more updates about things that have been happening in the initiative. I have a bullet here about the schema.org translation project. So again, Open Referral was kicked off when Google, through schema.org, proposed a civic services schema, which the W3C approved as web markup to structure data about services on the web for search engines to index. Nobody really did much with it until a couple of years ago. I partnered with the Stanford Design Lab and the Legal Services Corporation and a group of legal service providers in Florida to take HSDS and align it with a specified service, a service schema for legal aid, which we've now documented. We've shown that by marking up service information using schema.org's tags on websites, you can improve search results. You can improve the relevance and the quality of search results. which is very exciting. And we've developed a first version of a translation between HSDS and schema.org, although it's specific to legal aid. In 2022, we will be generalizing our translation of HSDS and schema.org and building some translation tools. So we're excited about that. It's still a little bit open-ended of where that project's going to go. I've included links to the project page for the legal services pilot. And if you're interested, I want to hear from you. One more thing, the Gravity project. Two more things. The Gravity project is developing terminologies to describe social circumstances, right? Social needs and goals and types of referral protocols. They're doing this through HL7 with support from the Department of Health and Human Services Office of the National Coordinator of the Health Information Technology. And so this is a different parallel or sort of like intersecting standards initiative. And I am serving as the Gravity Project's strategic advisor on community resources and engagement. We will be mapping through the Gravity Project in the next year HSDS to FHIRs. FHIR is a healthcare interoperability set of protocols. I've already talked with Tim Berezny on this call up in Canada. They've been mapping HSDS's description of social service providers to FHIR's healthcare provider directory module. And we will be figuring out how to develop a translation between HSDS and FHIR and the tools for interoperability in the next year. If you're interested in health and social service interoperability along the same lines of the social prescribing that we've heard from the UK, I'd be glad to be in touch and connect some of those dots. Tim, maybe we'll have a couple minutes to hear from you about that in a little bit, but I'm not sure if we're going to be able to squeeze it in. But it'd be great to share. If you have anything to share in the chat or the document, please go ahead and do so. Last thing from me, and then we'll do some show and tell. I've been partnering with the Indiana University Ostrom Workshop on the Commons, and I put together a paper with support from them that's now been published in the Cambridge University Press's Handbook on Commons Research Innovation. You can see a link to this paper in the document, and we've also developed infographics that accompany them. This is an analysis of the resource directory data problem as a commons tragedy. And we apply some, fairly technical, not in the software technical sense, but in the academic sense, some frameworks for understanding why is this such a hard problem? What would it look like for communities to develop sustainable and equitable solutions to this problem? This paper is, I think, only 10 pages long. It crams a whole lot into those 10 pages about what we've learned and where we think this field is going. And the infographics, I hope, might be useful to you and your partners in thinking through a strategic approach to solving this problem, understanding this information as a vulnerable resource that technology cannot magically solve for us. So again, happy to answer any questions about the Ostrom Workshop, or if you're interested in using these materials in your community pilot, let's hear from you later. If there are no other questions, no burning questions, it'd be great to hear from Skylar and also from Devin, maybe 3 to 5 minutes each, max. Show us a little bit about what you've all been working on. Skylar, you want to go first?
Well, I think Devin actually has a little more of a time constraint, so let's have him go first.
All right, Devin, hi, hello.
Hi, I mean, sorry I couldn't make it, and I do have a time constraint. We've produced OR Services application, which is a monolithic Laravel app that can and also the Open Referral Airtable template. I can post links if people want it, but I'd say that the app is it's a few years old. It's served like a bunch of clients. It's a bit clumsy, and we're looking in terms of just the development architecture. It's great in that it does a lot of stuff. It's like an old shoe, but I think that as we move on to the next level of, we're really excited about the UK, the US coming together around a shared API and shared schema, and basically bringing bringing all of the tooling to bear. I mean, ORUK, I unfortunately couldn't make the first half of it, but has a lot of great tooling. I think that would be useful for the US community. And the US community, I think, has a lot of use cases that can fit some of the ORUK work. So really just excited to see that the communities are like coming together. I hope we can do these meetings kind of more regularly and kind of conduct a conversation, in a horizontal manner around to me, like how to bring the work done on both sides of the Atlantic together. We're going to work a lot faster and better if we work together. And nothing I've seen from the ORUK work and the HSDS, the ORUS work, to me seems like it couldn't integrate and move forward together. So I'll yield my time to Skylar and others, but I hope that people who, last thing I'll say is that people who value this work and see it being useful, I think our next big task is really just bringing these two work streams together, and I think we need particularly on the US side, all hands on deck for how to think through and get that done. So there's one API and one schema to rule that we can all move forward with together. So that's it for me. And I saw that Greg dutifully and thankfully posted links into the chat about OR services. Happy to talk to folks more about that. Happy to talk to folks more about Airtable as a great way to onboard kind of community groups and groups with less technical capacity and less legacy systems into the open referral schema.
Right on. Thank you, Devin. I agree. In the next conversations, it'll be much more conversational. We just wanted to get through this whole round of updates. I've also included in the notes a link to the final report from the DC pilot, where we implemented OR services in partnership with the city's Medicaid agency and the Primary Care Association. It includes a little bit of technical stuff, but the link to this report, which is now in the document under show and tell, that actually contains a much more detailed sort of strategic view of what is the path forward for communities who are trying to find solutions to the data production problem. So I encourage you to read through that report if you're interested in thinking through what are people learning in the field about this work. Okay, Skylar, let's see a little bit what you've got with Connect 211.
Yeah, sure. So I work for a company called Site Savvy. Our project is Connect 211, and we're working with Washington State 211 in the US. We're working closely with Tim Sullivan and team. I think Tim is on the call here as well. And we created a search engine. So it's kind of map-based, it's pretty speedy. Our bias is towards using existing services and kind of best-in-class service providers like Elasticsearch, for example. We were not particularly interested in reinventing the wheel for search engines. And it's been coming along pretty well, but it got us through a lot of kind of the proof of concept stuff and deeply into the standards themselves and questions like, so how do we define eligibilities and that kind of stuff. So I've ended up actually broadening out and getting a lot more involved in standards kind of work groups to push those standards forward in the US. And that's partly governance. But I do think one of the things I wanted was a place to work through some of the technical stuff and share notes with y'all, but also kind of hear what are some of the common patterns that we find emerging in terms of eligibilities and things, because sometimes kind of working on the cutting edge like we do, we see some insights that are useful for the work groups, the more governance into, of the conversation. We have insight that they may not have at their fingertips all the time. So maybe that's one of the back cuts that'll come out of this. Yeah, so I linked out to our GitHub repo. It is an open source project. This is all JavaScript. It's all Node and JavaScript. It's in two parts, front and back end. And we would like for this, and then we're running a managed service that's Connect 211 to help fund it and keep this going. And that's had some good benefits for us so far. Like we can kind of iterate through improving the data connection between our data providers and then HSDS. So we've seen some implementations where we've stepped in and they're actually using a couple different organizations that deploy HSDS, and one of them will just kind of like do a quick mapping from the original data source to HSDS and then kind of leave it there. And there's a bunch of holes in it. And then we're kind of obsessive because we're more of a service model and we're sticking around. So we keep going back and iterating over that. And that's the other reason that we keep getting into the weeds of like, so how do we make a deeper integration between multiple data sources into HSDS? How do we map your data? How do we teach organizations to think in terms of this schema? So yeah, anyway, it's kind of where we're at.
Thank you so much. Skylar, I think we're gonna organize another opportunity maybe in December, maybe early in 2022 for people to do much more open-ended exploration of what the projects you've been up to. Towards your question about like, how do we facilitate an easier path into standardization of data? I also want to shout out the transformer and validator tools that we built that Devin at Serapis also prototyped for us. And I'm including a link. We're not going to have much time to detail it on this call, but I'm including a link to some feedback that we got from the Unity Foundation. Kevin, on the call, thank you so much for this feedback. We basically had some field testing and got a lot of positive feedback, as well as some suggestions for how we can, first of all, patch some bugs, do some upgrades, and potentially chart a path towards a sort of like emergent microservice architecture. Kevin, if you want to like give us a minute or two of your very high level assessments of the transformer and validator tools that we developed. We have like a minute.
Sure. Yeah, so yeah, we looked it over. We understand that it's kind of focused on supporting a local environment for a standalone server application. One of the things we looked at is how can we containerize that to do more of a cloud-based deployment of that. There's some things that we've proposed about how to deal with the file content that it needs to transform and validate, and looking at sort of service mesh implementations for that. And then there's also some recommendations we have on dependency updates that need to occur. And then perhaps there's an opportunity to do some rework on the Ruby implementation of the transformer that we could provide some support or some information on how we think that would work as well. And are you going to post a link to or I can put a link to the presentation and the document for people who want to dive in further?
I've included a link to the document that you gave.
Okay.
I'm not sure if it's open. So if you want to,
if anyone has any issues, then just ask for it, and I'll provide them with access. So.
Okay, great. And I'm also including links to the transformer and validator code in the notes. So a couple of final thoughts, and people can stay on and keep talking if you want after noon, but we'll try to wrap up in the last couple of minutes here for now. We want to do more of these meetings. We're going to get back on a quasi-regular schedule. I would welcome your feedback. I think the following meetings, we're going to have much more of a conversational format where we'll set an agenda in advance, and we'll create space for people to actually discuss some topics at length rather than just hearing a laundry list of updates. I am planning to upgrade our documentation. Right now, we have technical documentation on the Read the Docs site, and then I have project documentation in a bunch of Google Docs. And my current plan is to convert the project documentation in Google Docs into Markdown files, load them into GitHub, and have the whole project documentation be right alongside with the product documentation on our Docs site. If this is something that excites you, working with documentation, I'd love a buddy in working on that project. And if you have opinions on how we can restructure the documentation, we're in the process of working with Open Data Services Co-op to do that. Most importantly, I think in addition to like one of these like hour-long meetings, I'd like us to pull together like much more of a workshop, potential at least half a day, maybe a whole day, or maybe several half days, maybe next quarter or 2 quarters from now, where we can actually get the whole network together, anybody who wants to go deep and create a sort of agenda to allow people to dig deeper into some of these difficult processes in ways that are facilitated and hopefully productive. Aspiration, our fiscal sponsor, has already offered to help facilitate that. Normally, like in pre-pandemic times, we would like try to get together in person and fly people in. I think we're not quite there yet. Maybe we'll get there in 2022, but we might use this interim to just make it easier to find time to get on a room in Zoom, but to go deep in unstructured ways in thinking through like some of the emerging challenges or you know, and potential strategies that we've discussed with a little bit more focus. So if you're interested in planning a network convening along those lines, please let me know. I would welcome partnership in that regard. I think I hit everything, even though this was a very rapid fire walkthrough. So thank you all for bearing with us. Even though I'm not sure any of this was in and of itself very satisfying, hopefully we've pointed you in the direction of a lot of different places that you can go to learn more. If you're interested in talking with other folks, I'm happy to help connect some dots and facilitate ongoing conversations that we can then bring back to a next assembly, hopefully sooner than later. Any final questions or suggestions? And again, I'm gonna jump off in a couple minutes, but people are, Skylar, if you're able to like leave the room open, if people want to keep talking, like I'm happy to, you know, it's up to them. But
yeah, I can leave it open for a little while here. Yeah.
Okay. All right, so I'm gonna start wrapping up, incorporating some notes, but if you all wanna like talk to each other or ask me questions while I'm wrapping this up, go ahead.
And I'll go ahead and terminate the recording here as well.
All right, cool.
Right. Thanks, Greg.
Thank you, Kevin.